The three pillars of digital photography are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Together, they contribute to something called the exposure triangle. Meeting a balance of these settings is the key to getting the perfect picture in any light setting or environment, and when that balance is set, we say that the photo is perfectly exposed. We'll take a look at these one by one and also talk about some other important concepts related to digital photography. Let's start with shutter speed.
The first side of exposure triangle is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time for which the camera sensor is exposed to light. There is a shutter like a sliding window right before the sensor that moves up and down to let light reach the sensor. In a DSLR, the sound of the camera clicking a photo is mainly due to the movement of the shutter. The shutter speed is measured in seconds, and more time the shutter is open, the more light can reach the sensor and better would be the exposure. The range of shutter speed time, as shown here, can be from 4,000th of a second to 30 seconds or even more with bulb mode. Also to remember is that the shutter speed is directly proportional to the amount of light entering the camera, which means that the amount of light at 1 by 400th of a second will be half the amount of light at 1 by 200th of a second. So for a 30-second exposure, the shutter will remain open for 30 seconds. This is used at places with extremely low light conditions and require the camera to stay stable for all of 30 seconds. On the other hand, a 1 by 2000th or a 1 by 4000th of a second shutter is extremely fast and should only be used with very good light to freeze a very fast moving object. Here is an example of slow shutter speed. The movement in the crowd and light trails are captured, but the buildings and the billboards are absolutely still. This was taken with a 8-second exposure and the camera mounted on a tripod to keep it stable. In the next example, we see that since there is ample of light, the shutter speed is much faster and gives proper exposure to bring out colors and shadows. Let's talk about the bulb mode. In this mode, the shutter remains open till the time the shutter button is kept clicked. There are a few things to keep in mind before using the bulb mode. This mode doesn't have to be used only if you need exposure for more than 30 seconds, but it should also be used when you do not know the required time for exposure. For example, in this photo where we have captured two beautiful lightning strikes, the shutter speed is only 8 seconds, but as determining the time for a lightning strike is impossible, we use the bulb mode and release the shutter as soon as the lightning struck the ground. Here, let's do a small experiment. We have switched off all the lights in the studio and only have one light source, which is a flashlight from a mobile phone kept at around 2 meters from the subject. In these kind of settings, it is important to use a camera remote. As discussed in the previous section, these remotes can be of any type, wired, wireless, or a camera app. Also, we'll need a good stable tripod like the Manfrotto 055 we have used in this demo. Now we'll take two photos, first one at 1 minute exposure time at f5.3 and ISO 800, and the next one at a 5-minute exposure at same f5.3 and 800 ISO. Here you can see that even with extremely limited light at 5-minute exposure, the camera was able to create a usable photo. One important thing to note here is the processing time. Now, when you take a photo with a 1 by 200 or a 1 by 400 shutter speed, the camera can process your image really fast and you do not have to wait for the camera to process the image before taking the next photo. But when you go to long exposure modes, the processing time is a major factor. For example, here we can see that a 1 minute shutter time took 30 seconds to process. Effectively, the total time to take this photo took 1.5 minutes. Similarly, the 5-minute exposure took 5 minutes of processing, so the final photo took 10 minutes to get ready. Also remember that with long exposures, especially with shutter speeds more than 5 to 10 minutes, consume a lot of battery because of this processing time. Make sure you have ample of battery when using long exposures. Now let's do another experiment and see the effect of low or high shutter speeds. In this demo, we'll see how to create ghost-like images using low shutter speeds and also see why we cannot use high shutter speeds for such effects. Here we have kept a very simple setup that you can easily create at home and do this experiment with us. Just place any object at a small distance from the camera. We have used natural light coming directly from a window and falling on the subject. Now, at first use a 1 by 640 second shutter. Also use timer from your camera to take the photo. As soon as the timer is about to go off, start moving your subject. You will notice that no matter how fast you move the subject, it always comes perfectly still. In the second part, reduce the shutter speed to 20 seconds. You may need to adjust aperture and ISO accordingly, as 20-second exposure can overexpose your photos easily. Try taking a couple of shots to check if after 20-second exposure the photo is still looking good. Now again, put the timer on and click the photo. When you hear the shutter sound, keep the subject at the same location for 7 seconds and then move it to a second location slowly and let the subject be at the second location for 7 seconds as well. When the photo is done processing, you'll notice that these two locations, the subject is dark but still translucent. Also, the movement path is also visible. We would love to see your photos with this experiment. Please share your photos with WPC community with tag Ghost Effect. Low shutter speeds are good for low lighting conditions. The subjects need to be very still for the amount of exposure time to get them perfectly stable. Low shutter speeds are usually used in landscapes, astronomical, and other fun and creative kinds of photography. On the other hand, high shutter speeds are good when we have ample of light in a scene. These are usually used to freeze the frame or stop the motion in a scene in sports, vehicle, weddings, and street photography. For any questions on this, please use the Ask a Question button to send your query. Now, let's talk about aperture.